Hello and welcome to the Cyberden, your weekly dose of tech and games. I, Jake, will be chatting with none other than award-winning composers Andrew Barnabas and Paul Arnold, aka Bob and Barn, better known as the masterminds behind the soundtracks for the MediEvil series. Thanks for coming, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Nice to meet you, Jake.
Please tell everyone listening, what inspired you lads to enter the world of composing, and how did you get together as a team?
So, I was always a massive nerd. So, potted history of me from age 7. My mum enrolled me as the youngest member of Croydon Computer Club in 1980, and at the same year gave me piano lessons. So there was a wonderful parallel career, learning all about, interest, learning all about games, spending all of my free time in the computer room, learning to program Commodore PETs, amongst other machines. And at the same time, I went to musical school, learning various musical instruments, piano, oboe, violin, guitar. And it was about 10 years later after that, when I was tender age of about 16 or 17, and my mum, someone showed me a package called, originally I was actually writing music on the Commodore 64, but then someone showed me Soundtracker on the Amiga, and that was it. I was completely hooked. And I managed to land my first gig because I was part of the Amiga demo scene and entering competitions there. There were people there who worked in the games industry and said, "You ever thought about music for games?" At the time I was 16, so truth is, no, I hadn't. It was a real job. But I thought about it long and hard and actually thought, well, why not? Give it a whirl. So I contacted various computer games companies and, cutting a long story short, in October 1990, I landed my first commission for a game called Swiv on the Amiga. And that's probably a potted history of me to begin with. I'll let Bob take over here.
Well, my background was simpler than that. I'd always wanted to have a career in music, but it's that age-old thing of how the hell do you go about trying to get a job in music? I'd done the obligatory write a letter to the BBC, which makes you feel better that you've actually done something, but of course it just goes in the bin. And I had no clue. And then luckily for me, I'd done a master's degree in music technology at York University, and one of my good friends from the course had applied for a job at Millennium Interactive in Cambridge, which was where I met Barn. And he, for some reason, couldn't actually go for the interview and said, "Why don't you phone them up and see if you can go instead?" So I did that and found myself at a job interview there. And curiously enough, actually, he ended up going for the interview, and of course I got the job, which was rather awkward for some time, but we're still good friends, so that's okay. And that's where Barn and I met, and that was in 1996. And I found myself, I wasn't actually originally employed to be working on compositions. That was actually Barn's job. I was working on pretty much anything else that wasn't composition. So, I was doing voice editing, some voice recording, sound effects, that pretty much everything else. But of course, I always wanted to write. I was qualified to do that, and that's what I'd studied for many years prior to that. So, I, one way or another, sort of wormed my way in.
So I suppose, yes, so to just carry that on, I was freelancing from about 1990 to 95 whilst I was at university and sixth form college doing work on Amiga and the old PC games and things like that. And then, yes, I got the job as the in-house composer at Millennium, where Bob and I met. That was completely out of the wrong order, but hopefully it'll come across.
Let's play a track from the MediEvil remake soundtrack. This is a sample of the song The Sorcerer Returns. Okay, so do you guys have any favourite composers, bands, or better yet, favourite video game soundtracks out there that come to mind?
In the world of film, of course, I mean, with what we do, I mean, there are people that we look up to and admire. I'd have to say Thomas Newman is someone that I've long since admired. I really like his very individual sound, the fact that you can recognise his score a million miles away, and there's always something very individual about what he does and his take on writing music to picture. So I love that, and I've just recently watched the film 1917, which, again, incredible score by him. I've always been a big fan of James Newton Howard as well, and one of my favourite films was Sixth Sense, and he scored that, and it was one of the things that I noticed he was doing on one of the cues, which was a very simple piano piece, but he was adding and subtracting a beat here and there, which sort of made you unsettled in a way, because there was a rhythmic meter if you were just tapping out every crotchet, but there was no real sense of where the bar line was, and it was a very subtle mechanism to make you feel uncomfortable, and I've always found that level of detail in movies absolutely fascinating.
And to add to that, I've got something, I suppose, one of my first memories, age 5, was being taken to watch Star Wars, so I can't deny the influence of a certain John Williams was very prominent. And some more. In fact, I was a big fan of Wojciech Kilar's score for Dracula in 1992, and his work in Ninth Gate after that. More recently, I'm a big fan of Michael Giacchino. So I would say a lot of the Hollywood classics. Of course, Jerry Goldsmith was another big fan. I was a big fan of his particularly his score for Total Recall and Basic Instinct were two which stood out for me. And of course, you can't deny the influence of certain Hans Zimmer. I mean, obviously he gets a certain rep for good and bad reasons, but I can't deny, as a film music producer, he is constantly reinventing the wheel, which is something I hugely admire. So I suppose if we're talking about things like outside of film, I would have to say it's one of my favourite bands are the Cinematic Orchestra. I'm a big fan of Jamiroquai, Stevie Wonder, and So if people say to me, what kind of music do you like? I generally say funk and film scores.
Actually, my musical influences growing up was definitely more in the rock vein, and I loved all that sort of cheesy hair metal growing up, and still do, and still fairly regularly attend gigs, bands like Dan Reed Network and that sort of thing. So I've always liked rock music, sometimes with a funk edge, sometimes fairly straight, and usually very cheesy.
This is a sample of Lucky Cup. Let's talk about your music contributions to the hack and slash MediEvil series, starting off with the PS1 games first. So, what were your inspirations and aims and the direction you were going for when you were making the music for these?
Well, actually, it was a really good project to work on that perspective for a couple of reasons. Some games, you work on. We were in house at the time, so we were given the project to score. It wasn't a case of we had to sort of bid on it or anything as a freelancer. But and some people will come to you and say, literally ask you for suggestions. What kind of music would you like? What kind of music do you think would suit this project? Which is kind of like, it's a good and bad thing to do. But Chris Sowell, the designer of MediEvil, he had a very, very clear idea of what MediEvil should sound like, largely because he had a very clear idea of what MediEvil should look like. It took a very strong visual and tonal influence from the Nightmare Before Christmas, the Henry Selick / Tim Burton animation film from the early 90s, I think 1990. And also gameplay-wise, there was a series of arcade games called Ghosts and Goblins and Ghouls and Ghosts, sort of 2D side-scrolling platformers from Konami from the 80s. And both of those, MediEvil was a sort of hybrid, sort of like updated 3D version of that. So musically, it was a very simple thing because he loved the look of Night Before Christmas. He also loved the sound of it. And so, both of us knew the composer. Danny Elfman was a well-known name back in those days, even back in the 90s. And because he had such a brilliant handle, what I can sort of call a gothic humour, where he had a very unique tone, which absolutely perfectly fitted the tone and humour of that kind of thing. So, and in fact, it was the first time that we'd ever been asked to write music in a style of a film score. Most of the music before then was probably a little bit more sort of traditional game scores type of thing. But this was like, here was a Hollywood film score, go on and analyse it and go and kind of do your own take on it. So that was a bit daunting to begin with, especially since we were doing it with just effectively one synthesizer and one sampler. and learning how to figure out how to write for an orchestra, having never done that before. But it actually was a really quite fortunate, because both of us were musically trained. It did help enormously. We were able to sort of analyse, pull apart an orchestral score and go, what makes Danny Elfman's score sound like a Danny Elfman score? How does he orchestrate it in such a way that makes it feel like that has that sort of humour about it? It's sort of playful approach to these things. So actually that made it, it was daunting, but at the same time incredibly rich rewarding, because we knew exactly the kind of thing we were going for. I mean, it wasn't the only reference. The other reference was because they didn't want it to, because Danny Elfman's score was much more sort of the comedy vein. They wanted MediEvil to be a little bit more serious. So we had Elliot Goldenthal's music for Interview with the Vampire, Dracula's score from Roger Killer I mentioned earlier, and we also had one other, I think it was Christopher Young's score for Hellraiser. So they were the more kind of the horror-edged. So effectively, I sort of pretty much 3 or 4 different scores to approach. Throw those 4 into the cauldron, add a bit of Bob and Barn, and see what comes out at the end.
Actually, one thing that could be added is that was actually MediEvil 1 was the first piece of music that I wrote commercially, actually. That was how I managed to worm my way in. We'd got those CDs that Barn was just mentioning, just kicking around in the studio, and I put one on one day and sat down, did a kind of analysis, looked at the harmony, looked at the melody, looked at rhythm, orchestration, and how he was putting his music together, if you like, and then started to use that as inspiration to write a track. And I wrote a waltz. It was pretty simple, but it did make it into the game. I can't remember which level it went on, but it did make it into the game in the end. And in fact, I think it's been in most versions since.
So what kind of equipment were you using back in the 90s?
Oh, actually, it was a pretty basic. Well, I say it was basic. I mean, we had a full Pro Tools studio there, which was unbelievable actually for its time. But I mean, if we compare it to what we have today, it was a pretty basic setup. We had a decent mixing desk. We had a JV 1080 synthesizer, and we also had an Akai S3200 sampler, which was fully expanded to a massive 128 megabytes of RAM, which...
No, it was 32 megabyte RAM, Bob.
Oh yeah, sorry. Our EMU was 128, which we followed on and worked with in years later. Yeah, it was only 32, in fact, even then. 128 seems so small now. But obviously now the whole system and the way that we do things is completely different. So it just seems rather amusing to me to think back to how we had to create music back in the day.
I would also like to add to that actually sort of not only did you have limited hardware, but it was also a case of learning how to write music for an orchestra, and that again was a very unique. We had to kind of figure out how to do this, and I can sort of see the evolution of that. The first time we used MediEvil, the first time we kind of wrote a MediEvil game, we had there was a patch called Strings, which is just a kind of like a kind of a nice sort of a paddy sort of nice legato string sound, and then we had one for pizzicatos, a plucking sound, and one for marcatos, a sort of like slightly more rhythmic sound. But as things developed, we started having, rather than having a one for the whole of the string section, we had one for violin 1, violin 2, viola, cello and bass. We started sort of just expanding and just learning how to really write for an orchestra. So it was much a lesson in technology as it was a lesson in composition. So yeah, we were definitely, it was a very basic day. I mean, I suppose my only analogy would be like, sometimes I would argue some of the best melodies that have ever come out from a Commodore 64, because you had such limited hardware to work with. All you could do is spend your time focusing on those hopefully wonderfully memorable melodies. Whereas nowadays you can do whatever you want very, very easily. So it's less hard to do that. So I think, yeah, you look back on how you've written some of those original melodies and go, wow, that's I would never do that now. But at the time it was we felt it was quite groundbreaking.
Time to play a track from the MediEvil remake soundtrack. This is a sample of Master of the Mausoleum. So what was it like working in-house at Sony Cambridge? Do you have any fun memories working there?
there were some absolutely great stories. There were some brilliant people that we worked with. There's still very, very fond memories of some of the trips that we had abroad. Sony would put together these conferences, and I know that we went to Tenerife one year, and we went to Athens another year, and it was all expenses paid. It must have been astronomically expensive for Sony to do, but they were great fun. They were always very alcohol fueled, and we had some very interesting experiences on things like that. Also in the office, we had a great team. There was a video engineer in our department and the audio manager, and I just remember the video engineer one day coming in a little bit hungover, and he just said, guys, I just need to keep my head down for a while. I feel terrible. So he went to sleep underneath the mixing desk, and unfortunately for him, they were showing some Japanese sort of businessmen around the offices that day, and they walked into the studio very unexpectedly. So I gave him a quick nudge under the desk, and brilliantly, I have to say, he managed to improvise very well, stick his arms underneath the patch bay and say, "That's all sorted now, guys. I think you won't have any more trouble with that." And then he just skulked out. Awesome.
Yeah, I suppose I can add to that. Yeah, it was. It felt like a sort of like anything else. You were in the trenches, because we were sort of, as they kind of joked, we were in a sort of ivory tower, because we were on the, sort of the second floor, and most of the development teams were sort of on the ground floor. And the development teams at that time in MediEvil, I think we had MediEvil sort of 3 teams: MediEvil, Bog, Frogger, and Beast Wars happening simultaneously. About 20 or 30 people per team. And they would all come upstairs, and sort of we would sort of get involved in doing all the sound and music for all of their games. And it's funny, actually, you could tell, especially when the artists have spent a long time rendering and animating a nice F&B sequence for MediEvil, for example, they would just be so curious as to what we would do, because they were loving the fact that we were effectively, what they were concerned, bringing their animations to life. First, we were doing all the sound design, we were adding the footsteps, the Foley and everything else, and some dialogue and stuff like that, and then we'd be adding the music on top, and they would just pop in, like, probably once every couple of hours, and just kind of go, "Can you just have a little quick look what you're doing?" So it was that kind of sense of camaraderie, and you were definitely working. I mean, you were working some silly hours, working very much late into the night. I mean, a lot of us were in our early 20s, didn't have much in the way of stuff, which we didn't have any families, sort of, so to speak. So we would work silly hours. I've got some strange footage of us, and so we got very used to having takeaway dinners while we were in the office. And I've got some lovely footage of us trying to do some stupid skateboarding stunts while waiting for some food to arrive one afternoon. And yeah, it's one evening even. So yeah, it was just like definitely that sense of we were all in it together, trying to get stuff done. I will go one tale. And that was the end of what must be MediEvil 1. Now, this is the days, this is pretty much pre-decent internet. And so in order to go and to demonstrate new versions of a game, they would literally have to cut a gold disc. In this case, it was a CD rather than DVD. So it was kind of, gold CD. And I remember them, they just finished animating. Well, unbeknownst to us, there was a final sequence in the game where the main hero, Dan, effectively, he goes into the Hall of Heroes, and he sort of effectively retakes his place amongst them, and actually earning the respect from his fellow peers, which he never had before. So he kind of like jumps in, and he sort of somersaults across the big kind of like big banqueting table, lands with a drink in his hand, and tries to drink. Obviously quite difficult to do because he hasn't actually got a lower jaw. And then just everyone claps, and he goes up into the Hall of Heroes, into the sky. Wonderful sequence. But we only learned about this about, I think I seem to remember, more like maybe 7 o'clock in the evening. They come up to us and go, "Guys, yeah, we've got to send off a gold disc tomorrow off to Japan," or wherever they were going to, at 9 in the morning. And we just animate this little last sequence. Can you like sort it out? Kind of do something. So literally, we're like 7 in the evening. We had to then do this whole final sequence throughout the night. I don't know how many hours we spent doing it, but it was a fair few. So first we had to like transfer the video over to what we could use, sort of format we could use it in the studio, watch it through. It's probably about a minute and a half long. Figure out how to do all the sounds for the characters. There was actually they were sort of playing a medieval, as opposed to medieval, a medieval tune, like a proper old school bit of folk music from the 15th century. They had animated a sort of a lute player, sort of strumming a lute. So we had to like watch the loop play animation, figure out what tempo the loop player was playing it at, work out a piece of music. We had what we call library music CDs in the loft of the building. Library music, they are exactly what they say. They are literally a kind of collection of music CDs which you can like pull off the shelf. A lot of music you hear on TV will be using that stuff, and just to save money and time. And because we had never written a bit of MIDI folk music from the 15th century, we looked it up we had to look up in the catalogue. Do we have anything in our in the reference? We did. There was some medieval music there. Had to go and find it, figure out what made medieval music sound like medieval music, try to replicate it, and getting some lute samples together, work out what tempo of the piece was, record some percussion and everything else. And in fact, the percussion didn't sound particularly good, so I ended up going into the live room myself and recording myself playing the tambourine. Just a very simple tambourine line, but it sounded much more authentic than the very robotic samples we had on our synth. And in fact, I always remember one thing where I actually dropped the tambourine, and it sounded brilliant. Like a really blum, 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 blum. It floated, it literally. I was like, that sounds really good. And because there was the point where when Dan walks into this Hall of Heroes, the doors open, it was literally like a record needle stop moment where everyone stops and looks around. And because the music was being performed by the band, this was the music would stop. And in fact, this was a perfect opportunity to have this tambourine drop added to the music. So that's exactly what we did. And and then basically as he goes up through the sky and goes up, we have to write this big epic Hollywood-sounding orchestral ending for him as he goes up into the sky, and it's all nice, happy now. So, but this wasn't finished. Probably I don't know what time we finished. It's probably 1 or 2 in the morning. Had to render it, convert it to the right format, give it to the guys, and then they literally went off and got it on a plane the following morning. And that was pretty much kind of par for the course. I'm sure that probably happened maybe not once every week, but every few weeks these kind of late night things would occur. So much of games development at that point was last minute, oh my god, how are we going to do this? How are we going to solve this problem? We've got to work into the evening to get it all fixed. So yeah, I would say that's pretty much par for the course of game development in the 90s, and probably not hugely dissimilar now.
Let's play another track from the MediEvil remake soundtrack. This is a sample of The Prodigal Skeleton Returns. Now let's cover MediEvil Resurrection. Now 5 years after the second game was released, you guys decided to work on that soundtrack. One of the biggest differences compared to before was that you actually used an actual orchestra. So how exactly did that come into fruition?
Well, a few years before, actually, a couple of years before, we'd worked on the score for Primal for the same studio. And we'd always obviously wanted to work with an orchestra, and that was something that we'd been trying for and we'd been discussing with Sony, but of course no one really had those kind of budgets around at the time. But as luck would have it, a good friend of ours, Michael Price, who's now a very successful TV and film composer in his own right, was recording a score for a feature film at Abbey Road. And he said to us, do you want to come down? And of course, yes, we do. And we said to him, do you mind actually if we bring along a couple of people with us? And we saw it as maybe an opportunity to show some of the more influential people at Sony and the money men, basically, what the process could be like and what it could bring to the table. And I don't think either of us had any illusion that it might actually be the key turning point, but we just thought it was an opportunity to show them the process. So anyway, we went along with Phil Harrison, who's the vice president of development for Ski at the time, and also with Rob Parkin, who was the studio head at Sony Cambridge at the time. And we stood there for, 30 minutes, maybe an hour, just watching this incredible process and these amazing string players play Michael's music. And then Phil just said, come on guys, let's go into the bar and talk numbers. And luckily Barnard found out how to do the same recording process in Prague. We'd already kind of second guessed that we probably weren't going to get a budget to do it in London or LA. So we'd already looked for more cost-effective alternatives. Over to you, Barn. You can explain that part of it.
Well, it was actually, it was good because we knew at the time, because we'd never recorded an orchestra, and we were also very, and Michael Price was really helpful in this one, and because not only did he help us go to a session, but he also gave us some advice, because we were so used to doing everything ourselves. He said, actually, with this thing, you need to get your posse, you need to get your people together, you need to get your orchestrator, your copyist, your conductor, your music editor, and your engineer. So, and well, actually, I think it was actually 6 people, because your fixer, which is the kind of parlance word for orchestral contractor, someone who picks all the players in the orchestra. And we didn't know anything about any of these people. We'd never done that before. So we just basically took lots of advice, and he gave us some suggestions of people to talk to and everything else. So effectively we worked out that it wasn't just the cost of the orchestra, it was the cost of preparing the scores, the cost of getting the scores printed out for all the players. In the case of Primal, I think it's something like 7,500 pages of score printed out for it. But and then get your orchestra, your engineer and everything, and basically you get your posse together. We did that, so we worked out it wasn't just the cost of recording the orchestra, but everything else all around it. And so yes, we worked out that basically to record I think it was about an hour and a half worth of music. This is for Primal. They needed to record it in London. This is back in 2002. It's about 90 grand to record it in London, about 60 grand to record it in LA, and about 30 grand to record it in Prague. So basically, that's what I always like doing, is like, let's give them choice. Let's give them the choice. So yeah, we went in there and just had them, here are your 3 options, and let us know what you think. Now, the funny thing is, they took a very long time to still make their mind up. But I guess, to be fair to them, they'd never done it before. So this was a big leap of faith for them. So, and at the time, we sort of shot ourselves in the foot, because every project we'd worked on in an orchestral style since the first MediEvil game, we'd taken an opportunity before we started the project to improve the technology, because things were moving so quickly in the way sampling was working, and the way the samples with realism and everything else. And before we started the game Primal, the sampling side of things had moved from recording everything, using everything in RAM and a hardware sampler, to actually streaming from hard disk on a computer using a studio software called GigaSampler and later Giga Studio. So basically, we sort of shot ourselves in the foot, because our orchestral recreations were sounding that much more realistic. So to the point where the producer said to us on Primal, said, well, why should we give them money? This sounds good enough. It sounds really good. And the truth is, it did sound really good, but until you hear the real thing. And you do realise at that point there is still a huge chasm of difference apart. So, but fortunately from that perspective, they did at least then ring us up 6 weeks later and just rang up and said, you've got the budget for the orchestra, which was like, amazing, an incredible moment for us. So that was a good challenge for us. So when MediEvil Resurrection came around 2 years later, 2004, it was actually a far easier sell, because we'd already opened the floodgates with Sony for recording an orchestra cost effectively in Eastern Europe. In fact, it was the first time I think they'd been done in Eastern Europe. We've actually opened the floodgates for this to happen for lots of other companies. And so it was much easier to sell, because they knew what this was going to bring to the table. At that point, going to MediEvil Resurrection going, maybe we should just give you a budget for an orchestra. We didn't need to do any of that hard sell. We'd already spent the time doing that before. So from that perspective, it was a breeze. And obviously, from our perspective, it was the 3rd MediEvil game we'd worked on. 1 and 2 we really wanted an orchestra for, but was never going to happen. 3, this is what I love about this version. The MediEvil, it was a launch title for the PSP, as you know, it was a handheld little tiny thing. So it was brilliant that we actually finally get the budget for a full orchestra and a massive choir, and on the speakers the size of my iPhone.
This is a sample of Gourd and Evil. Alright then, let's start talking about the PlayStation 4 remake of MediEvil. So, when you were told about the remake coming up and you guys were asked once again to make music for it, so what were your reactions? I also heard that Sony weren't too hot about getting you guys to make new music, just sticking to the remake, so how did you manage to change their minds as well?
Well, what happened initially was that, well, obviously we were in discussion with them about doing music, and we very much wanted to do new music for it. So we sat down and we came up with the idea that let's start how the original game had started, with that sort of opening ploddy introduction to Graveyard, and then morph into something new. So we did a demo along those lines, and we were both pretty pleased with it, and we sent it over to them, and I think, I mean, they were very happy with the demo, and they said, well, at least we know we've got the right guys on the job. They could really recognise the compositional style. But I think that also helped them to understand quite clearly that they were doing a remake of the original game, and that they wanted to be a lot more faithful to the original game than we were being, by doing an alternative track. That said, along the way there were definitely some weak links in the chain for us on the original score. Namely, when you get to the final boss, there's sort of three waves of attack, and they were pretty much all covered with either previous music or with one specific tune which we did for Zarok's Lair, and it wasn't one of the strongest pieces we'd ever done. So that opened the door. We'd done a new version of Zarok's Lair battle music for Resurrection, which everybody was happy with. But then there was still the Lord Kardok section, and prior to that the Phasgors. And we all kind of agreed then that these were two great opportunities for new pieces. And we did strongly feel that, even though it was a remake, the die-hard fans out there not only would like to hear better versions of stuff that they did know, but also have some new material, something to show the development, if you like, of the franchise. So we managed then to convince them to do, I think it was 4 new pieces. But on the whole, it was largely faithful recreations of the old music, sounding the same but better.
How did the songwriting process go down this time, and what was it like remaking and remastering the old tracks?
Fans of music ourselves, we didn't want to just hear the same thing again. Even if we could add bells and whistles and do other things to it, we knew that we wanted to actually hear something new. I knew I would want to hear that if I'd had any sort of any remake of a game. But what I wanted to do was effectively, this is where it became a bit of a dream come true. How often do you get the opportunity to go back to a project you worked on 21 years ago and redo it how you always wanted it to? First off, with a real orchestra, but secondly, interactive. That was the real key change. The music for MediEvil 1, 2 and effectively the 3, MediEvil Resurrection, the tracks were non-interactive. I mean, technology was basically what limited us on the first 3 games, is that we knew it was more important for us to have the music sounding realistic as opposed to having the music reflect more what was going to happen on the screen, because we knew that there would be such a huge trade-off in trying to do it interactively on those earlier versions. It would have had a demonstrable effect on the quality of the overall result. Too much, far too much, especially given it as an orchestral style of music. Whereas this version now, we could actually do what we always wanted to do, and that was effectively, because MediEvil is effectively kind of a medium-paced action adventure. There are lots of sections where you're sort of running, you're sort of walking around, hacking and slashing. Also times where you're sort of exploring nice scenery. Dan is getting his ass kicked. Dan is enjoying the nice scenery. So there was a kind of like a reasonable sort of pace, sort of like a range of pace of the game. But generally it wasn't crazy frenetic and it wasn't crazy slow. So we had to, because the music wasn't interactive, you had to kind of pick a tempo which sort of somewhere in the middle. And because it was quite a slow game, we actually kind of picked quite a mid-tempo track. So actually, quite one of these I think we love what makes MediEvil so much is because it's not just high-energy games music. It's actually a bit more slow. It can be a little bit more elegant, a bit more paced, a bit more. But you can actually have some time to think about where you explore themes and do all those nice things that you can do which music is slow, rather than having to always reflect exactly what's going on with basic high-action, high-intensity music. So, but the problem was, if Dan was getting his ass kicked or he was enjoying nice serenity, the music wouldn't change. The closest we had to interactivity was actually when, if you had a big boss fight, we could swap to a boss track. But that was pretty much it. So the important thing now is, what can we do? How can we take what we did 22 years ago now, and expand upon it in a way which keeps the essence? Because once we had the feedback from Sony that they wanted it to sound like the tracks from the original game, we were sort of our hands were tied to a certain degree, is that we knew we had a framework we couldn't really move a great deal away from. So the question was, what can we add or subtract from it? The first thing is that once we analysed the tunes, one of these, I think the reason that they were so well remembered is because some of them had lots of very long, drawn out themes, long melodies, which you could sort of come hang your hat on. But what we discovered is that you take those themes away, and in fact all the backing and the orchestration and the way we developed it was, how to put it politely, very basic. Bear in mind that we'd never done this before, so our way of approaching the orchestration and everything else was incredibly simple. It was effective and it worked at the time, but actually it was, having then now worked with an orchestra pretty much the last couple of decades, doing a lot more, then we actually, hopefully we've learned some skills which we can apply to that. So what we ended up realising we could do is that if people wanted to hear the original tune from MediEvil, yes, we can do that. Let's rip away everything else apart from the essence of that track. Let's take the theme. What made that track sound like that track? And it could be a melody, a tiny melody, which could be 1 instrument or 2 instruments long. Everything else behind it, we could redo again. Whether it be a case of adding completely new backing or just reorchestrating and improving what was there before, it gave us scope to do that. And also what it gave us scope to do was to add or remove layers. Because one thing we also found about the game is that, say for example, a game might take 10 or so, maybe 10-20 minutes, but it's average on sort of 10 minutes, especially on the early levels, to complete. Because of the technology limitation we had on the PS1 is that the tracks could be no longer than about 2.5 minutes long. And because we couldn't seamlessly loop them, there was always going to be a sort of a slightly loading time between the start and end of the track as you seeks on the CD. We knew we couldn't have it seamlessly looping. So therefore, the way we wrote it is you started the track really quietly, it came loud in the middle, and then ended really quietly. So then with the looping bit, you will sort of hopefully be reasonably seamless. So here, but because the tracks are roughly 2.5 minutes long, if a game took a level took 10 minutes to complete, all you would do is you'd hear the same track 4 times. And it wouldn't develop, it wouldn't change. But obviously that was really good because it didn't reflect in any way what was happening to the character. So what we ended up doing was experimenting with how could we expand upon these tunes. First idea was to add layers of rhythm. Add layers of either percussion instruments, whether it be just a sort of, as you say, tambourine, drums, just general sort of basic rhythmic instruments, which we generally play ourselves. But you could then use them over the original track. So the track went bum, 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 bum. You could have a tempo track going bum, 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 bum. Double the tempo of the original track, but it would still effectively be the same. The tempo of the track itself would remain unchanged, which meant that we could use the original track. But then you're just adding a level of intensity, which meant that it was a bit more frenetic. The second thing, which is actually what Bob had this wonderful idea of adding a level of what we call spiccato strings. Spiccato strings are sort of rhythmic short string lines where you're going, where the strings are playing not your long legato, beautiful thematic passages. It was much more the rhythmic lines. Again, you could do this on double the tempo the same way you could do this as the percussion. So and also then we could add layers where you could take instruments which would recorded lead lines on the original tune and then have different instruments play them. So you could have a different variation. Say a clarinet would do a lead line, and here you could have that on the flute or on the strings or the bassoon. So you could have different takes on the same. So what we were effectively trying to do was to add loads and loads of variation. So that when it came, and then because all this was going to be then produced in layers, so you could have all the individual layers on the PS4, and then the game would then choose which layers to play. You had so much control over, so much different options variety, that hopefully you'll be able to choose enough variety so that the player wouldn't effectively notice that the tune is effectively repeating. You'd have enough new material to effectively feel like the tune was progressing. So then also we tried to work out how do we split up the levels. Because these 2.5 minute tracks were kind of normally sort of 3 or 4 different bits, where like I have an all intro section, there were like more of a main theme section and maybe a variation. We could then effectively, rather than we could sort of divide the levels into sort of different difficulty areas, and then the music for you would hear sort of the music for roughly about a third of the first third of the track, the opening act, so to speak. and on all those variant layers on that, they would all play amongst each other, new percussion, new layers, new vibrato, and everything else, until you reach a certain point in the level. You opened up a certain gate, a certain door, and then you would go, and then the game would know that you've got to a next level of part of the game, and then you start hearing the second act of the music. So you would hear the first act and the second act, and then as you get towards the end of the level, you would start hearing the third act. So effectively, the music, in theory, inverted commas, the music would progress as the player progressed through the level. So all these different elements meant that every single tune had a raft of new material. We tried to present it in a way that you wouldn't sit there and go, oh my God, what's this? What's this? Is something new? It was done in a way, hopefully, which was subtle and with respect to the original source material, so that the players would sit there and go, oh, I know that. That's the Cemetery track. Oh, I know that's the Hilltop Mausoleum track. But with so many different things underneath it going on, that it would feel like it progresses to the level as the player does. So effectively, we were always doing a MediEvil track as we always wanted to, but could never do it back in 1998.
This is a sample of Damn Overboard. Do you have any favourite tracks from the series?
I've always been a fan of the end credits because it's one of the pieces that's followed every iteration of the game right the way through. And actually, we were very fortunate last year that that music was played at the PlayStation in concert at the Royal Albert Hall with the London Philharmonic Orchestra, the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra, I should say. And it was absolutely wonderful gig, and we've never really heard our music played in the UK by an orchestra of that caliber. It was just a fabulous experience. So I'd be lying if I didn't put that in my top 5.
I would also say I think Hilltop Mausoleum has a certain soft spot for that. Largely, I think it was the first time I've ever written for an actual organ before. And I still, to this day, I try to work out what I played on that organ line. I still think I have no idea how I came up with that weird, very strange riff, but that seemed to have a certain one. And I would also say that for me, there was a fairground in MediEvil 2, actually, and this is one of the first tracks we sort of had a go at trying to make it interactive, because there were sort of different rides you could go on, so like Coconut Shire, and I think there's a couple of things in there, and we said, actually, how about we have a chance to play different tracks as you try different rides. And the fact there was, so I think the track, we actually called it Comedy Corpses, and that was, it was great fun little thing, little ditty to work on. And it was a good thing because also this track would also develop in 3 different ways, and sort of kept the audience, and definitely myself, very, very amused.
This is a sample of Killer Corn, or Is It Wheat? Alright then, so let's move away from MediEvil briefly, and let's talk about the fact that you've made music for a lot of adverts, trailers and the like. So how different is it composing for those compared to making music for video games?
Well, usually the process is linear, which actually makes it a lot easier. When we're working on a feature film, for example, we would drop the movie on our timeline and then drop markers all the way down the timeline that line up with key sync points throughout that particular queue. And of course, it's always the same, no matter how many times you watch it, which is, a big difference with video games. And it's a double-edged sword. It's a big technical challenge writing for video games, because you have to respond to the fact that it's interactive and that it will always be different each time the game's played, and how do you react to that. But with a movie, because it plays back the same every time, it gives you a chance to synchronize much more accurately and engineer the music much more closely to fit with the picture and really depict and follow the storyline in a way that you never could with a video game. So, like I say, it's in some ways it's easier, but in other ways it's harder, and perhaps you could even argue more fulfilling. It's not as big a technical challenge, but I'm always very satisfied when I see a cue played back to picture in a movie, because the sync is so accurate, because you really can be, well, absolutely, you'll be frame accurate throughout the whole cue. And so for me, that's certainly one of the key differences. And of course the same thing applies for TV ads and anything else that we might work on. That's, the non-interactivity is easier and yet perhaps sometimes more satisfying.
Yeah, I would say it's interesting that I never would have thought that working in games back in the early 1990s would end up helping actually to have a career as scoring TV and film. But it has. It's been a very satisfying process. I think largely because when I started writing music for games, it was all chip-based. It was all Commodore Amiga, Super Nintendo, things like that. It was all, the music was being generated by the computer itself. And it was when we started working in the CD audio world, where we started using the same technology we were, the same equipment we would be ultimately now using to write music for film and TV. For me, it was like I'd never predicted just how one would help in the other. But I also did find it incredibly satisfying to know that actually that the process, as Bob said, these days we are effectively we are media composers. That's what we do. Whether effectively the majority of our work is working music for picture. So in the last sort of few months, we worked on there was a wonderful little show over Christmas called Richard Osman's World Cup of the Decade. Did that for ITV. We're working on our 10th feature film called Me, Myself and Die, which is our first romantic comedy. We're working on, there was a quiz show we did for Endemol, which fortunately didn't get picked up for pilot. And now we're working on season 2 of Dead Pixels, which is for E4. Well, funny enough, I'm working on that today, writing an orchestral theme tune for it. So, and I'm sure I'll be using some of the skills which I will have picked up from working on MediEvil. So all these things these days, it's effectively it's just music, and the fundamental difference, as Bob has said, is whether it's interactive or non-interactive, and whether you're working on a TV advert, a film or TV show, and everything else apart from games is definitely is linear. But effectively, other than that, you're still sitting in front of our sequencer, working with writing music, which will effectively either get left in the sequence or go and be recorded by other musicians and brought together and everything else. So it is ultimately it's something I would never have predicted, but I love the fact that music is now music, and we're sitting in front of the same bit of software writing music for it, and just the medium we write for becomes less and less relevant. It's the fact that we're just still writing music. It's just nice. The only thing I would say was definite benefit is like you work on a game, you go and visit the game development studios. It's a load of guys and girls sitting around, and effectively what looks like many cases looks like a bit of a call center. But whereas you work on a TV show or film, you have some sort of glamour involved. You might go to a nice premiere. You might go and attend the recording. I would say anyone who listens to this, if you ever get a chance to go and visit a set, will be a TV set or a film set, go along, because there's something quite magical about how buzzy that environment is. We've got a group of people. We were lucky enough to go and visit. We visited 2 or 3 sets, and towards the end of last year. But I loved working on. I think actually we're now working on Dead Pixels, and it's sort of, not only does it sort of dispels the myth, but at the same time it actually becomes enormous. You're like, wow, I can't believe you can make such clever use of the way a set has been put together, and even the line, when you walk around the main character's bedroom, and you just see that they've really thought through every single book on their shelf, every single bit of artwork up on their walls, and it's just all been very nicely well thought through. And it's like, I just find that environment really, really, really buzzy place to go and be around. So I can definitely recommend that. It's a nice, I think for me it's a nice thing to say that we can now Can't happily say that we work pretty much across the board in film and TV and games, and they all have their merits.
Actually, I'll just add something to the end of that. Something that Barnes said there just reminded me of when we worked on I Survived a Zombie Apocalypse. And I remember this was one TV show that was actually slightly different from the others that we'd worked on. Because the thing is, it was a reality show. It was being filmed and edited and put out so quickly. There wasn't time for them to send every single episode to us and have us score some music to it and, to heighten the drama. So what we ended up having to do was almost to put together an interactive score for it, where they would be able to add a rhythmic section underneath a bed and so on and so forth, so that these things could be pieced together and edited very quickly by their editing team. And I'd say that our work in video games really, really helped us in being able to come up with a process there that could work, because we'd worked in interactive media before. We were able then to apply the skills that we'd learned to that process. So the skills are portable from one media to another, and sometimes very helpful.
This is a sample of Have You Seen My Hand? Andrew and Paul, let me just say it's been an absolute blast. Thank you so much for coming on board to this interview.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for having us, Jake.
You're very welcome. Nice chat to you.
Anything you'd like to say to the MediEvil fan base out there?
I would say, I suppose, from my perspective, I say thank you for plugging away, because we never thought it was going to happen. We never thought another game was going to happen after MediEvil Resurrection. We had many, many people write to us. In fact, I would say probably 10 times more other communication from any other game, saying, when's the new MediEvil? And we were like, I'm sorry, we have no control over this. No. In fact, people would make fake trailers for the game, which I always thought was a very strange thing to do. But so we didn't even believe it. And in fact, it was a fan who wrote to us and said, I think there's a new MediEvil coming out. Send us a trailer, link to the trailer. The trailer didn't have any new footage, so I said, I'm sorry, nothing to do with us, but I don't think it's real. The same fan then wrote to us a week later and said, I think it is real, because he sent a link to us. It was an internal Sony conference in the States where Sean Layden, the ex-global chairman, said, I've got a surprise for everyone, and opened his shirt to reveal a T-shirt underneath which had Dan Fortescue, the main character MediEvil, on it. I was like, oh, maybe that is real now. So I would say it's one of those things where MediEvil would say thank you to the fans for plugging away at Sony, because we knew there wasn't an appetite in Sony Europe to do this, but someone in Sony America went, I think this is a franchise worth bringing back. So I would like to say a big thank you to all you guys for your help.
Yeah, I'd reiterate that as well, and just say thank you to everyone for following us and supporting us. We've had the new score's been very warmly received by most people out there, by the look of it. The game seems to be doing well, and we owe that very much to people out there who are going out and voting with their wallets and buying the game. And fingers crossed it won't be the end of MediEvil. That maybe they'll either remake one of the others or even make a new one. Who knows? We certainly don't at this stage, but we've got our fingers crossed, and watch this space. You can check us out, by the way, on Facebook. We've got an artist page on Facebook. And any information that we get that we're allowed to post, we'll post on there. So check it out, and thanks.
And I'd like to thank all of my wonderful Cyberdon fans out there for checking out this great interview. So, guys, thank you very much, and see you later.
Cheers.
Cheers.